Welcome to episode 74 of Tales from the Hangman's Record. My name is Steve Fielding. All the stories in this series are taken from my 3-volume series of books, The Hangman's Record, covering every execution in Great Britain and Ireland between 1868 and 1964. Copies of these and many of my other titles can be obtained through my website, stevefielding.com. I'm extremely grateful to everyone who has helped so far towards the running costs of the last year. If you enjoyed the video, can you spare £1 or $2 to help the channel continue to grow? Donations can be made by clicking the thanks button on the YouTube video or with the link paypal.me/thehangmansrecord. Use the comments below for your thoughts on the case, whether justice was seen to be done, and suggestions for further episodes in this series. One of the first steps for detectives investigating a murder is to eliminate potential suspects, and in most cases this starts with immediate family. For a killer to risk the death penalty, which was in place during the scope of these stories in this series, or life imprisonment in modern times, it would, in most cases, mean there was a motive, however obscure or sometimes trivial, that set off the chain of events leading to the murder. Today's tale from the Hangman's Record is one such case. A happy family celebration savagely cut short due to some tiny grievance or crossword leading to a brutal double murder. It was supposed to be a happy occasion. 23-year-old dapper Jewish advertising agent Daniel Meyer Raven and his pretty petite auburn-haired wife Gertrude Marie, also 23, were celebrating the birth of their first child when, on Monday the 10th of October 1949, he went to visit her and their 4-day-old son at a Muswell Hill nursing home in North London. Also there, doting on their new grandson, were Marie's Russian Jewish parents, 49-year-old Leopold and 47-year-old Esther Goodman. Marie's parents left just after 9 o'clock, and shortly afterwards her husband bid her good night and followed. Less than an hour later, at shortly before 10 o'clock, Esther's brother-in-law, Frederick Freeman, along with his wife and daughter, called at the Goodman's house at 8 Ashcombe Gardens, Edgware. Freeman was a business partner in L. Goodman Radio Limited, and the visit was to check on the welfare of Marie and the baby. Receiving no response to their ringing the doorbell and knocking at the front and side doors, Freeman climbed into the house through an open window. Making his way inside, he was horrified to find the bodies of the Goodmans lying on the dining room floor. At 2 minutes past 10, he dialed 999. The police were soon at the scene, and realising the seriousness of the situation, the squad car radioed back to the station and a call was put through to Scotland Yard. Superintendent Peter Beveridge, along with Detective Chief Inspector Albert Tanzil and Detective Inspector John Diller, were tasked with leading the investigation. Beveridge immediately asked for the assistance of pathologist Dr. Donald Tier. Looking into the facts as they were so far available, detectives learned that earlier that evening the Goodmans had been to see their daughter at the Muswell Hill nursing home not far from their home. They also learned that their son-in-law, Danny Raven, was also at his wife's bedside, that he had left just a few minutes after her parents. From the timings, it seemed the couple had only just returned home when the murder had taken place. They also assumed that Raven must have been one of the last people to see them alive. As they made their way to Ashcombe Gardens, Beveridge asked if Raven was at the house. Diller told him it had been spoken to and should be there when they arrived. Reaching the house, Beveridge noted it was a modern, spacious, detached house surrounded by a beautiful garden. Entering, he saw what he later noted was the most revolting sight in 30 years of service. The Goodmans had not merely been murdered, they had been butchered. Both bodies were lying on the carpet with terrible head injuries. Goodman, completely dressed except for his jacket, was in the middle of the room, his head towards a fireplace. On the table were his spectacles spattered with blood, and it seemed he had been sitting at the table when the first blow was struck from behind. The solid mahogany table had a large indentation in the centre, as though the heavy weapon had glanced off Goodman's head and smashed onto the tabletop. It appeared he had tried to rise and had been then struck again, knocking him to the floor. Lying just inside the door, with severe head wounds, was the body of Esther Goodman. She had been struck from behind, and again there seemed to be no evidence of any struggle. The walls were splashed with blood, and it seemed she had been battered with the same weapon. In an adjacent ground floor room, detectives found something of interest. Here was the open window Fred Freeman had used to gain entry. The window had an iron framework and opened outwards. This was an important clue. The only way to open the window without breaking it had to be done from the inside. This window was the killer's likely exit route. Beveridge went into the kitchen and found the heavy base of a television aerial lying in the sink. Weighing 2 pounds 8.5 ounces, the detectives were in no doubt this was the murder weapon. It fitted the mark on the mahogany table exactly, and despite an attempt to wash it, congealed blood was still visible on the base. Upstairs, the dead couple's bedroom, were clear signs of disorder. But to the experienced detectives, things didn't seem as they first appeared. The Goodmans were a wealthy couple, and even a cursory search found large quantities of money in a drawer and in the safe. A significant amount of cash was found under the mattress and over £2,500 in the safe, with the keys still in Goodman's pocket. A woman's coat and handbag were lying on the floor beneath the quilt that had been dragged off the bed. Although there was no money in the handbag, clearly visible on the small table between the single beds was 6 £1 notes. The open window, disorder in the bedroom and the rifled handbag all suggested that the murder had taken place during a burglary. But 6 £1 notes lying in plain sight would surely not have been overlooked by a thief who had time to rifle a handbag. Beveridge and his team had just finished their initial examination of the murder scene when Daniel Raven arrived at the house. He was made to wait as detectives first wished to interview Fred Freeman, who had discovered the bodies. He said he was on friendly terms with the dead couple and involved in the electrical equipment business that Goodman ran in the West End of London. He said that the Goodman's daughter Marie had married in June 1948 to Danny Raven, and they lived nearby at 184 Edgware Lane in a large comfortable house given to them by Mr. Goodman. On the 6th of October, 4 days previously, Marie had given birth to the son, and each evening the parents visited the nursing home just a few miles away, usually accompanied by Raven. They had returned home between 9:30 and 9:45. Freeman, who lived nearby, called on the Goodmans each evening at about 10 o'clock to get the latest news on the health of the new baby and its mother. On that evening, Freeman arrived with his daughter at 9:55. He noticed that the Goodman's car was already in the garage and there was a light on in the hall. He rang the bell, and when there was no reply, he went round the back and found the window open. He shouted, but there was no answer, so he decided to investigate. He climbed through the open window and into the hall. There, he found the body of Esther Goodman. Freeman said that he knew the light switch in the living room, where the bodies were, was on the woodwork near the floor behind the door. He walked in as carefully as possible, felt for the switch, and then saw the body of Mr. Goodman. He was still alive but unconscious and died almost at once. Freeman said he immediately dialed 999 and then called the local doctor. He also added it was the second time that evening he had been to see the Goodmans at their house. Freeman said he had called just before 8 o'clock when Mr. Goodman said they were going to make their usual visit to the nursing home. Inspector Diller called the nursing home and a sister confirmed and said that the Goodmans, along with Raven, had left shortly after 9 o'clock. Beveridge's experienced eye noticed many things, quickly enabling the team to draw a number of conclusions. He had lived in the Edgware district following promotion to chief superintendent and knew the location of the nursing home and the likely journey times. The detective estimated that driving by car to the scene of the crime would have taken around 20 minutes and that the Goodmans must have arrived home at around 9:30. At 10:30, a police officer had telephoned Raven, informing him that there had been a terrible incident at the in-laws and asking him to attend. When Raven arrived at the Goodman's house and the news of the tragedy was broken to him, he seemed to be genuinely upset. He sat in a room comforted by some of the relatives who had since arrived at the house. Raven sat sobbing, crying, "Why did they tell me to go? Why didn't they let me stop?" Beveridge decided he wanted to interview Raven separately and asked Inspector Diller to take him to Edgware police station. Raven protested, but Beveridge was insistent and he reluctantly agreed. The experienced superintendent immediately noticed how clean his clothes looked, considering it was the end of the day. In the telephone call to the nursing home, Diller had asked the sister what clothes Daniel Raven was wearing, and seeing the young man sat on the sofa, whispered to Beveridge, "He's changed his clothes tonight." No sooner had Diller and Raven left the front room, the inspector was back inside and excited. Raven explained he had just had a bath and changed into the clean clothes when asked to come to the house. Diller said he had asked Raven for the keys to his house, and he had clearly resented it and became annoyed when the inspector said he intended going to the house. Reluctantly handing them over, Raven told the detective, "You won't find anything there, I've only had a bath." A patrol car took Raven to the police station as Beveridge, Tanzel and Diller drove to 184 Edgware Lane, about 500 yards away. Opening the front door, they were immediately struck by a terrific smell of burning. They rushed into the kitchen, the back door of which was open, and in the stove was the gas poker, blazing, and something was in the stove and well alight. Diller turned off the gas and the detective smothered the flames to stop the smouldering and carefully raked out the charred remains of a man's jacket and trousers. Beveridge immediately sent for Detective Superintendent Cyril Cuthbert at Scotland Yard Forensic Laboratory. Shortly after midnight, Cuthbert arrived with his chief, Dr. Holden. As the scientists examined the clothing, detectives made a further search of the house. They found a pair of blood-stained shoes in the garage and blood on the driving wheel and handbrake and front seat of Daniel Raven's car. The scientists were also able to say that there were heavy patches of blood on the clothing removed from the boiler, and all the bloodstains found were the same AB blood group as Leopold Goodman. And, while the detectives were unable to find any other clothing, such as a shirt and tie, there were traces of blood on the kitchen sink and in the bath. The clock struck 1 o'clock as the detectives left the house and drove to Edgware police station. Daniel Raven was sitting in the CID office when Beveridge and his men arrived. Beveridge told him what he had found and asked him for an explanation. Raven was truculent and began to shout, "What right have you to question me? What power have you got to hold me? None at all, let me go." Asked about the murders, Raven said he had wanted to stay the night, as his in-laws were apprehensive after recently being burgled, but they had insisted he go home. "I don't get on too badly with Mr. Goodman," he confessed, "although we do quarrel at times, but Mrs. Goodman and me didn't get on well at all." He then told the detectives he would say no more until he saw his solicitor. Sidney Rutter, Raven's solicitor, soon arrived and advised his client to make a statement as to his movements that evening. Raven was asked to account for the burning suit in the boiler, which he admitted was his, but could not explain how the blood got on it. He said he had left it in the bathroom, although officers could find no evidence of a bath having been taken. Raven's statement said that he had been to the nursing home with Mr. and Mrs. Goodman, and they had left a few minutes before he did. Raven had travelled alone in his own car, while the Goodmans went in theirs. He went in for a few minutes and asked if he could stay the night, as he had recently been burgled, and also he didn't like being in his house alone. The request was refused, and a few minutes later, he left and went home. When he arrived, he put his car away and was preparing a bath when he was told of the accident at the Goodman's house. He said he would be over as soon as possible and put on the first thing that came to hand and hurried over. He admitted that the clothing in the boiler was his, but added he could not account for it being there. Raven was detained in custody, and on the following morning a post-mortem was carried out by Dr. Tier. He found that Leopold Goodman had been hit on the head and face 14 times, and his wife 7 times. Dr. T had no doubt that the television aerial was the murder weapon. Beveridge then noted another important clue which suggested the killer was familiar with the house. In October, darkness fell at around 6 o'clock. When the Goodmans had returned home, they had clearly switched on the living room light, for Goodman had been sitting at the table and had taken his jacket off. Yet when Freeman found the bodies, the lights were off, and the switch was in a place where no stranger would be likely to find it. There was an ordinary switch in the hall in the usual place, but that at the time was disconnected through a fault. It was clear the killer needed darkness to cover his crime and to ensure the maximum time before it was discovered. Whoever it was, it must have known where the lower light switch was, and was very lucky in finding it. The detectives then held a short conference. All officers assigned to the case had been digging up what they could find on the relationship between Raven and his in-laws, and it was clear that there had been frequent quarrels. Also, Raven had been sacked from his father-in-law's business after some money went missing. Reconstructing the crime, Beveridge believed that Raven, in a fit of temper, had grabbed the television aerial base which stood outside the living room door and struck Goodman from behind while he was sitting at the table. Then he repeatedly rained blows on the stricken man. Mrs. Goodman, who was in her bedroom, heard the noise and ran downstairs, where she too was struck first from behind, with Raven having been standing behind the door. She must have turned round as the rest of the blows were in the face and on the front of the head. Raven, now faced with the two bodies in the room, had switched off the light and took the murder weapon into the kitchen to wash it. He knew that Freeman would be calling in the next half hour, and so as to not be suspected, he had made it appear as if a burglary had taken place. He had then opened the window on the ground floor, climbed out and gone home. This was a vital mistake. Raven did not know that the window opened only from the inside, and there's no other way of an intruder could have entered. As the rest of the house was securely locked, the killer must have been admitted into the house by the Goodmans. At 6 o'clock that Tuesday evening, less than 24 hours after the tragedy was discovered, DCI Albert Tansel charged Daniel Raven with the double murder. Raven was held in Brickton prison and visited regularly by his wife and solicitor. Following a series of remands, Daniel Raven's murder trial began at the Old Bailey on Tuesday, the 22nd of November 1949, before Mr. Justice Cassell's. Anthony Hawke led for the Crown, while John Maud KC led for the defence. Raven's story had by now been elaborated. He claimed that he had called on the Goodmans after leaving the nursing home, but had left them alive and well. He had then visited a cousin's house, but found no one at home, and had returned to the Goodmans to ask to stay the night. Getting no reply to his knocking, he had done what Frederick Freeman had done, and climbed in through the window. Then he had stumbled across Mrs. Goodman's body with her skull cracked open. Also on the carpet was the body of his father-in-law. Raven said he felt sick at the sight, and as he recounted this in the witness box, he swayed and grabbed the rail of the dock, appearing to be on the point of collapse. He said he had got blood on his clothes and shoes where he had knelt by the bodies. Overwhelmed by fear, he said, he fled the house and drove to his own home where he had burnt his suit and washed his shoes. The blood on his clothing was from the examination he had made of the bodies. When the police had telephoned, he had panicked and decided to burn the clothing in case they thought it was he that had committed the crime. John Maud also suggested that Leo Goodman had been a police informer, assisting the police with information about persons suspected of currency offences, and that the elderly couple had been murdered in revenge by a person or person unknown. The prosecution suggested that after leaving the nursing home, Raven had driven to his in-laws and battered them to death with the heavy aluminium base at the television aerial. He had then driven home where he had tried to clean off the blood from his clothes. He had expected to have more time to remove all the traces from the clothing and the car, but the visit to his house by the brother-in-law had started a murder inquiry, and when Raven was questioned, he could not hide the evidence. As he had recently fallen out with his father-in-law, and it was well known in the family that he did not get on well with Mrs. Goodman, he had panicked, believing he would be blamed for the crimes. No real motive was ever discovered or discussed but it was thought that something must surely have been said, some opinion or prejudice expressed by the couple that had provoked the nervy Raven to lose his temper. On Thursday the 24th of November, the third day of the trial, the jury needed just 59 minutes to find Daniel Raven guilty of the double murder. Black cap was draped on the judge's wig as he passed sentence of death. As Raven was taken from the docks to the cells below, Mr. Justice Cassells commended the officers in the case, in particular Inspector John Diller. He was the first to link Raven to the crime by checking on his clothing, and by getting the keys to the house had stopped the destruction of further vital clues. Raven was taken to the condemned cell at Pentonville prison, and letters sent out to Hangman, Albert Pierpoint, and assistant Harry Cook, with the provisional date set for Tuesday the 13th of December. An appeal was immediately launched against the sentence, and Solicitor Rutter now tried a different approach. Now the defence would suggest that Raven had been insane. No defence involving Raven's mental instability or even insanity had been brought at the trial. Raven had been discharged from the RAF, which he had joined when he was 16, on account of severe anxiety neurosis. He had been in a plane crash that he alone survived, and ever since had suffered from blackouts and a form of epilepsy. A doctor who treated Raven in the past stated that he used to suffer from blackouts and brainstorms. Another said he had a kind of epilepsy. The appeal was heard on Tuesday the 20th of December, but despite Maud believing they had a strong case, they failed to alter the verdict, the sentence was upheld, and the appeal dismissed. A revised date of execution was now fixed for Friday, the 6th of January, 1950. As Raven awaited his fate, a bitter dispute broke out between the prisoner's wife and her in-laws. In raising money for his defence, Raven had sold half his share of the house to his sister, and his parents were issued a writ for theft after they cleared out all the furniture from the house on Edgware Road, which was now standing empty. Marie Raven had moved in with her relatives and had sat in the witness box at the beginning of the trial, believing her husband innocent of the crime he had been accused of. But as the evidence unfolded, and hearing her husband's testimony and allegations that her father was embroiled in criminal activities, whilst making claims she knew were untrue, she changed her mind. Now believing him guilty, she refused to visit him at Pentonville, nor would she sign the petition for a reprieve, which grew steadily as the date of execution neared, reaching almost 20,000 signatures. All appeals for clemency, including a petition to the King, failed, and at 9 o'clock on a cold winter morning, Daniel Raven was hanged. Furnished with information that the condemned man stood 5 foot 9 inches tall and weighed 144 pounds, Pierpoint worked out a drop of 7 foot 8 inches. The LPC4 form noted that cause of death was fracture dislocation of the third cervical vertebrae and the partial laceration of soft neck tissues and the separation of the spinal cord. It was claimed after Raven had been executed that he had murdered his father-in-law so he could take over possession of the electrical business. Raven had once worked there but had been sacked for stealing. His father-in-law had forgiven him and helped him to find work in the advertising agency. The legal wrangling over Raven's property continued until the judge found that the house, which had been a gift from her father, was the property of the widow. And less than a year after her husband went to the gallows, Gertrude Marie Goodman, having reverted back to her maiden name, remarried, telling a reporter she wanted to forget the name Raven and hoped her son would never find out why he had no grandparents on his mother's side. You'll be watching another episode of Tales from the Hangman's Record. Until the next time, thank you and goodbye.